So again, why should we as Christians even care about whether or not Darwinism is viable today? Well, as I said, we're in a war. We're in a spiritual war. Darwinism is an essential component of a hostile worldview, which is in bitter conflict against God and against us as Christians in our culture today. And this is not a minor kind of issue. It's one that is deceiving in a profound way multitudes of people, including young people, and keeping them from God, keeping them from understanding the gospel, keeping them from Jesus. And so I believe it's an essential aspect of our apologetic, of our defense of the faith today. And again, I showed these two statements that represent these two worldviews, two views of what is ultimate reality. Of course, that's indicated in the first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Versus the statement by Carl Sagan, part of the series named Cosmos, began airing in 1980. Carl Sagan said the cosmos is all that there is or was or ever will be. So,
but hasn't that one been refuted because don't they believe now we had a beginning? So it couldn't have always been.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's really not.
Yeah, I guess their defense is that there was no time, not even time before the Big Bang. So time began with the Big Bang. So there's, the cosmos is all that there ever was, in that sense.
Okay, when time began.
Yeah. And we looked at the main features of Neo-Darwinism, which is an updated version of Darwin's theory introduced in the early 1940s. But basically this continues even today as the default understanding of how evolution works, the main elements of evolution. It includes Darwin's concept of natural selection. We saw that he got from just looking around at plant and animal breeders of his day and applying it to the natural realm. It's to that, Gregor Mendel's laws of inheritance were added in the early 20th century. And then also in the early 20th century, the phenomenon of mutation, genetic mutation, was discovered, and that was added in. So that's, whereas Darwin did not understand where variation comes from, a source of genetic variation was discovered, and so the secular community jumped on that, and now that's the only source that they acknowledge for where genetic variation comes from. Random changes that, for example, radiation causes in the genome. So these are the three main elements of Neo-Darwinism. And that's what we're critiquing. Discoveries made since the 1950s have shown that this framework is bankrupt as a scientific idea, and we're considering 10 major reasons why. We've listed those reasons, and 2 weeks ago we began our consideration of the first item. Life at the molecular level is unimaginably complex, but beyond that it is irreducibly complex. And I didn't quite finish that last week. We're going to finish up on that. A quote from the introduction of Michael Behe's book, which I recommend, called Darwin's Black Box. In the introduction, Behe says, modern science has learned that ultimately life is a molecular phenomenon. All organisms are made of molecules that act as the nuts and bolts, gears and pulleys of biological systems. So I've been trying to drive that point home, that indeed life at the molecular level is, life is ultimately a molecular phenomenon. And we see little machines millions of machines that move and rotate and do things are in each cell that we have. Literally millions of moving parts in our cells. Another picture of that, we looked at ATP synthase, which is a rotary motor. Some of our cells have as many as 1 million of these machines in them that are driven by electrical charges, hydrogen atoms, and convert adenosine diphosphate adiphosphate element to make ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and that molecule powers most of all this molecular machinery. And this is what that molecule looks like, energy carrying molecule. And as I mentioned, our bodies produce recycle about 1.5 ounces that is in our bodies about once a minute, depending on how physically active we are. And so that you multiply by the number of minutes per day, that means our bodies recycle about an amount equal to our body weight every day. So this is a major process that most people are unaware of, never even heard of, but is absolutely essential for our bodies to function, for us to think, our brains to work, our heart to work, our muscles to work. Every cell uses a lot of ATP just to perform its basic functions. That little robot, every step it takes requires 1 molecule of ATP for that robot to take a step. And we saw this little animation the last 2 weeks of this ATP synthase motor. I emphasize that this system is in every living thing on Earth, from the simplest bacteria to humans. Plants, everything uses this same basic machine to produce ATP. And I also last week we saw that all this molecular machinery has to get manufactured, and we looked briefly at how that happens. The specifications, coded specifications, it's carried in our DNA. Most of that DNA is in the cell nucleus, and then there's a machine that there's a process by which the information that's in the DNA gets translated into proteins, and often there's multiple proteins in a given machine, as we saw in the ATP synthase. And these machines that actually manufacture the string of protein, amino acids connected together to form a protein. These machines are known as ribosomes, and we see that the way that works is that there's a copy made of the information in the DNA. It's copied into a slightly different molecule called RNA. In this case, it's messenger RNA, and that functions as a tape that goes through this machine, and as it goes through, another little unit called a transfer RNA, which carries an amino acid unit. It has a code or a key to it that has to match up with the RNA, and this machine then grabbing these out of the environment forms this growing protein chain. So we saw that last week. This is what the structure, it's been worked out. This is for a bacterial ribosome. Our ribosomes are slightly larger, slightly more complex, but essentially do the same thing. And again, these little machines, these ribosomes, depending on what tape gets fed to them, can generate about 100,000 different proteins in our body. So it's a pretty much a universal manufacturing machine. That essentially this one machine is able to manufacture most of the components in our cells. Now, since last week, I went online and found a video, and I'm going to play that for you, just to show you the ribosome in motion. Let's see. All right. So here, this is the messenger RNA, that string there, and it gets fed into the small unit, ribosome unit, and it needs to get started. There's switches that start things going, and then the large unit attaches to it when it knows that it has to produce a protein, and so these first two transfer RNAs are very important getting the process started. And so that this first one is in place. This next one depends on the first codon in the RNA. So it gets in place, and then a few little other things have to happen to get the process started. That's what's going on now. So this little unit has to come in, and there's tests to make sure this is a valid string of a messenger RNA. So when everything is when the various chemical tests are run, switches are run, now these transfer RNAs start bringing new amino acids into the and so now the transfer RNAs are bringing those amino acids, and it's generating this protein chain that's coming out a hole in that large unit. So the tape's running through there. It's generating this protein. Now, many of your cells have as many as a million ribosomes. So this is something that's going on all the time. You have several trillion cells in your body. So this what's shown here is going on at an unimaginable rate in your bodies, all at the same time. You have no idea of all this happening, but this is the complexity of how proteins get manufactured.
No wonder I'm tired.
You'd mentioned in the earlier picture that how it depended on how active you were, how fast they were. Is that true with all of the cell reproduction and the activity that goes on? If faster you go, the more they go.
I would. There's things. There's just like, you're on a job and it's intense. You have to prioritize how what you focus on. The cell has to do the same thing. Depends on what the priority is. If it's a muscle exerting, working, then other processes, cellular processes, have to take somewhat of a back seat. And then, so if there needs to be more protein made, that generally has to wait until the cell is less active.
When you're sleeping.
When you're sleeping, yeah. So the answer is no. Not everything gets speeded up. It's a matter of priority, and there's a good management system. God's created it to try to be an optimal system. Would you agree with that, Sharon?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then when he was talking about the cell reproducing, that's a different story.
Yeah. So we haven't even touched on the fact that cells can divide and make another copy of themselves, and when that happens, there's a lot of new proteins have to be made. So yeah. Okay. So again, that's what we saw last week, how all this gets made. We saw briefly that there is a 3-letter code that's able to specify the 20 different amino acids that make up proteins in our body. I'll get to say a lot more about this. The four in the DNA, the four letters are A, C, G, and T, and each one of these is what is called a nucleotide. This is what these nucleotides, these four nucleotides look like from a chemical standpoint. They're composed of carbon. They're carbon rings: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, all the detailed structure of this has been worked out, and we saw last week the way this ribosome works. It first joins these amino acids together in a very particular sequence. Immediately after they come out of the ribosome, they start to coil and form, depending on the charges of these amino acids, different kinds of structures. In some cases, sheets, and eventually these things, if they're going to work, they have to fold correctly into a three-dimensional structure that has some kind of biological function. It can be an enzyme, for example, that catalyzes some kind of chemical reaction. Many of the proteins in our body are enzymes that catalyze and enable chemical reactions to go, say, 1,000,000 times faster than they would otherwise. So there's just incredible technology here. We saw that it's been possible to work out each one of these letters is a different amino acid, the exact sequence of amino acids that make up, for example, human hemoglobin. So as far as I know, I think all the 100,000 proteins, we know the amino acid sequence of each one of them. And so that's so it's just mind-boggling. And I spent a lot of time last week showing there's no way a random process could test anywhere even a tiny fraction of the possible combinations of amino acid sequences that could give a functional protein. The vast majority of these won't even fold correctly. They're totally unsuitable for any kind of biological function.
How much of this information was available to Darwin, or was this later on?
None of it. All of this molecular biology, since almost all of it has come out since 1950. The structure of DNA was first worked out in 1953, and this genetic code was first really worked out around 1960. And so, all this structure that you've seen here is the detailed structure of these molecules. Most of that's happened since 1990, and much of it since 2000 even. The 1997 Nobel Prize was given to the scientist that worked out the structure of the ATP synthase motor. That got him a Nobel Prize in 1997. So this is relatively recent that this has happened. It's mostly in our lifetimes. Okay, and so we saw last week that neo-Darwinism relies on random mutation of existing genetic instructions to generate new proteins. If you want some new protein, new function, new machine, that the only way that can come about in neo-Darwinism is basically having mistakes arise in an existing piece of DNA, and somehow you hit the magic combination to produce a new protein. And last week we saw that is from a mathematical standpoint impossible, just absurd. We saw the importance of that these proteins fold correctly so that they have some kind of actual functionality. If it's an enzyme, that the charge at the core of this protein are just right to catalyze a reaction, or if it's a hemoglobin molecule, it's got that iron atom in there and is exactly set up to carry oxygen around the cell. You know, these are extremely hard. We saw this research I mentioned last week. Somebody actually went in and changed amino acids and looked at the structures that resulted and looked at how likely a functional protein would be as far as if you're trying to create it by chance, and found that for a length of 150 amino acids, the probability that it would even fold is about 1 in 10 to the 77th power. It would fold and have some kind of biological function. And then we also saw, that's just a repeat of that, we saw how many rolls of the die do you have to test these possible sequences, we came up with, there's, at most you've got 10 to the 41st power of organisms that could ever have existed on Earth. These are, you know, bacteria. Estimated that 10 to the 30th, 2 times 10 to the 30th organisms currently exist reproduce per year on Earth. And you can raise that another factor of 10 to account for times in Earth history when it might have, conditions could have possibly been more favorable than they are today. You multiply by the evolutionary age of the Earth and you get this number. But this is so small relative to 10 to the 77th that it's hopeless in thinking any chance process could arrive at even one functional protein. But this is all you've got for all proteins in all of life. And we have something like 100,000. So it's just absurd that this neo-Darwinism it shouldn't even be considered science now. Okay, so the number of trials available is so pitifully small relative to the number of molecular configurations that are possible. A trial and error process is guaranteed to fail. Even if you're talking about a single protein, not to mention all of them, you have to get all of them. So I said it's inexcusable for anyone, and certainly a scientist, to claim that trial and error processes can discover the blueprint for even one biomolecule. These molecules are incredibly special. No material process can possibly arrive at their design. And that this issue alone is enough, is sufficient to falsify the entire neo-Darwinian framework. And in my view, it no longer deserves the status as a scientific idea. No longer deserves to be in any textbook. Yes.
Does any of this exist outside of organic life?
No. No. No, you can't. There's a guy back in the 50s, Stanley Miller, that got a lot of news. These experiments with had a glass apparatus with gas, methane and carbon dioxide and ammonia, and passed sparks through it.
Lightning bolts.
Pardon?
Like lightning bolts.
Yeah, and he had a special way of trapping the products in a cold trap, and he was able to show that you could have amino acids, a few of the amino acids form in this kind of environment, and that was heralded as that life had been created in the laboratory, which is ridiculous.
Only under reduction.
Yeah, oxygen would have destroyed it all had there been any oxygen in that environment. So there's been a lot of hype, okay, and a lot of people still to this day feel like Stanley Miller showed that life could arise spontaneously. But there's a long shot going from a few of the components that you need to something that's alive. And, you know, a lot of people, you know, they either have it that hasn't been explained to them adequately, or they're just so intent on trying to come up with a world where God is not necessary that they refuse to even listen to anything else. Okay. Now, moving on to this issue of irreducible complexity, we introduced that last week. Darwin states in his book, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. In other words, his theory involves just slight changes, numerous successive slight modifications. So his theory is predicated on that kind of process. Okay? He says if you could find some structure or organ in a living organism that could not have been produced that way, my theory would absolutely break down, completely collapse. It just is worthless. Okay? So Michael Behe, in this book, Darwin's Black Box, asked, what type of biological system could not be formed by numerous successive slight modifications? His answer, well, for starters, a system that is irreducibly complex. And he goes on to define that term. By irreducibly complex, I mean a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. Okay? Joel, are you tracking with what he's saying here? What kind of system he's talking about?
Mousetrap.
Yeah, and we used he uses the illustration of a mousetrap. Okay, and you take any of these components. You know, he doesn't include the staples to hold it together, but you could. You take away any one of these components, and it's worthless as a mousetrap. You know, it's give it 1,000,000 years. It's there's no way it's ever going to catch a mouse. So anyway, that's this concept. That's the concept of irreducible complexity. And Behe in his book proceeds to give many examples of why life is irreducibly complex. And since we just saw that animation of a ribosome, I think that's an excellent example of irreducible complexity. The ribosome is useless without the messenger RNA to read. So that means, and the messenger RNA is derived from DNA, and the DNA, is a complicated structure that relies on all kinds of processes in cell duplication for it to replicate. So you've got to have all of these things in place. Plus, you have to have all these transfer RNAs out in the cell cytoplasm. And you've got to have amino acids. So none of that is worth anything unless all those parts are there. And so that's an example of why life is so utterly irreducibly complex. Are you? I don't want to beat this horse too many times, but so thousands upon thousands, I'd say millions of features and subsystems within living organisms are composed of several, to use Behe's words, several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system effectively to cease functioning. You take away just one type of transfer RNA, and that's fatal. You know, any one of those parts that were in that video, the system ceases to function. And so he gives several illustrations of individual machines that are irreducibly complex. They need all their parts if they're going to function. And one is he uses is the cilium, a little hair-like structure in many cells, even in our own body. That in our body they tend for example, in our respiratory system, they're responsible for sweeping dust particles out of our bronchia, and so there's a very good design here for how these cilia work, and they have central microtubules connecting proteins and a dynein motor, similar to that little robot. And so all of these pieces have to be there for a cilium to work. If you take one away, it ceases to function. That's a simple example. One that's a little more, has more parts, more complicated, is in bacteria. Many bacteria have a flagellum that enables the bacterium to swim. It's like an outboard motor with a propeller. This cilium, or I'm sorry, this flagellum that whips around enables it, just like a motorboat, to swim. And it's got a motor-like, well, it's got a motor in it. It has many of the same parts as our electrical motors. It's got to penetrate through the cell membrane, and this rotary motion has to be transmitted through to the flagellum, and so there's a lot of different proteins that make up this motor. You take away any one of those components, and it doesn't work, doesn't function. So this is an example of a system which needs all of its parts, and there's no way to put it together in a piecemeal fashion. So that's another example he uses. And another type of example he uses are regulatory networks in our bodies. And some of you, most of you who, you're not engineers, you're not, and especially mechanical or electrical engineers, where this principle of feedback control, there are in many of our systems. You can think of it as your thermostat in your house. That's a way of controlling, keeping the temperature controlled within a fixed range in your house. Well, our bodies are just filled with these kind of networks that keep things operating within a correct range. And so I'm gonna just give you an example. One is blood coagulation, and this is a picture of a blood clot that's it's caught in a mesh of fibrin protein, and so this is the way. This is part of forming a blood clot and causing, if you get cut, causing your wound, helps you not to bleed to death, causes clotting and a shutting off of the blood flow, and that process has to be controlled very precisely, or else you would die. So there's a whole complex of basically proteins that come into play to control that process very carefully. And both the formation of the blood clot and then the dissolving of the blood clot. And I'm not going to take time. It's in Behe's book, and he's a specialist in these things. And he shows that in order for this process to work, there are dozens of different proteins that come into play, and you remove any one of these, and the whole process fails. And another example, he shows it's been worked out how what's called AMP. It's this part of the ATP molecule and one phosphate. How complicated do you think it is to manufacture that molecule? Well, this next slide shows just what's involved. And I'll just summarize here. This shows atom by atom how this gets accomplished. You start up here with this first, let's see what a square is. White boxes of nitrogen atoms. You start with this first nitrogen atom, and you successively add and take away atoms until you finally get to the AMP molecule. And that process involves 13 steps, requires 12 different enzymes, 12 different proteins acting, and 5 molecules of ATP, of energy, to produce one AMP molecule. And like I said, this is critical. It's used not, well, it's part of ATP, but it's used many other places in the cell as well. So this is just an example of I mean, and these steps that are involved are critical. You somehow do away with just one enzyme, and that process doesn't work. So again, just to give you an idea of just how irreducibly complex living things are, all of this chemistry, all this biochemistry, all this structure, all this machinery has to be in place, or the whole thing ceases to work. So we could spend days discussing just the highlights of how organisms at many levels are irreducibly complex, with subsystems composed of well-matched interacting parts that contribute to a basic function, such that the removal of any one of these parts causes that subsystem to lose its functionality entirely. And so this issue of irreducible complexity is lethal to Neo-Darwinian theory. And again, I'll just read, I don't want to belabor it, but this is what Darwin said. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not have possibly been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. I would say Behe is right. There's at any one of these levels of where you show irreducibly complex, any example is sufficient to satisfy Darwin's test, and it does cause his theory absolutely to break down. Any question or comment on that?
These processes that you've been explaining, wouldn't some of those be involved in adaptation? In order for an organism to adapt within its environment or its niche in nature, wouldn't some of these have to change? We have part of the genetic diversity that we have. You have slightly different versions of the same protein or enzyme, and so you may inherit one of them. Your parents, carried certain versions of those, and you inherit them. So they coexist.
Yeah.
The different versions.
Yeah, they coexist, and depending on the environment, one can be favored, and so that one you're going to tend to accentuate the fraction of the population that carries the variation that's favorable in that environment. So that's the way that adaptation works. But one thing that most evolutionists don't appreciate is that these variations seem to be, we can demonstrate it from genetics, have to have been there, put in there, created by God. They're not a result of mutation. most mutations are deleterious. They do not give any benefit to the organism.
So why do schools continue to teach it? Just, if you read that little paragraph, why do they insist on teaching it? I mean,
They're committed to atheism. We as Christians have allowed our schools to be taken over by the atheists. We have allowed it, and they're indoctrinating our children in atheism. And that's the agenda. I say it's high time we go to the school board en masse, protest, and insist that this stop, and insist that we're not gonna allow this to go on any longer. But and we're the only people that have the insight to understand. So as far as accountability is concerned, we're the ones responsible for this state of affairs, allowing it to continue.
John, with all the, you gave dates that it's very modern, all this understanding. So scientists who are even atheists or non-believers have to look at this and say that the Darwin theory is absolute bunk one way or another, but yet they still continue. How are they allowing it? I mean, even an atheist would look at the
That's all they
demonstrable
have.
stuff.
That's all they have. They have no alternative other than God.
But so they're lying to themselves scientifically is what I'm saying. Because what you're proving isn't even spiritual.
Yeah.
Pride.
Yeah.
yeah.
It's true.
There are those now, though, that proclaim there must have been an intelligent designer involved, but they still fall short of giving
Yeah.
that to God.
Who's the intelligent?
Yeah,
Who's the
But
alternative?
I would say in general out there, if you mention intelligent design, you get incredible pushback, incredible rejection. So most people understand when you talk about intelligent design, you are getting at the God of the Bible, the God of the Jews, the intelligent design movement. They were trying to put that forward as a religiously neutral position, which the atheists saw through it. Bible-believing Christians saw through it, and I believe it's true. You bring intelligence in it that almost to anybody, any atheist, it automatically implies God.
In my readings, the renowned scientists know that there's an 800-pound gorilla in the room, but if they acknowledge it, they'll lose their funding and they'll lose tenure.
Right.
So they tend to ignore it,
Right.
even though there's a lot of them that do believe that this is right.
Yeah. Yeah. There's lots of fear. I would say fear in the community that basically you rely on a peer review of your proposals, of your research proposals. Most research is funded by the government through this peer review process, and your whole career depends on your ability to continue to get your funding. And so these days, if you're known as that you believe even in intelligent design, that can be the kiss of death, especially in geology or biology.
Francis Collins is the geneticist who is the head of the Human Genome Project, which was government funded, and he acknowledges that he's an evangelical Christian, and he doesn't hide that from anybody. Yet even he's not using that to really promote intelligent design or anything, but I mean he's kind of he gets some criticism for taking that position, but he's just so good at what he does in what he knows that
Yeah.
he's out
Right.
there with that.
But he's sort of he helped launch this BioLogos organization, which is promoting theistic evolution. So he hasn't repudiated evolution.
Right, right.
He basically says that somehow there is an intelligence that works through evolution.
Right, but I'm wondering, if sometimes you might have to present it to scientists in a different way than just,
Yeah.
in your face
Yeah. Well,
religion where they promote, they can bring up these facts, these published facts, and just say, there's something more than just random molecules happening.
well, in my case, I worked in a prestigious scientific lab, and I was able to take a pretty bold public stand. If some of you want to look at the series, there was back in the mid-90s, there was about 3 years, we had an ongoing letter to the editor debate on creationism in our local newspaper in Los Alamos. And I've got about 65 letters posted, both sides. Give you a flavor of the kind of back and forth. And I wrote, a good fraction, probably at least 2/3 of the ones on the creation side. And so that caused me to be known by essentially everyone in town. And some of my colleagues that confide, said, I don't necessarily agree with you, but you're certainly adding some excitement to our community. I can hardly wait to get home in the evenings to read the next installment of the debate.
And then there's there are these debates with Stephen Meyer, and then he'll debate various atheistic scientists, and most of the scientists will have to admit, you kind of bring things down to a level, like this irreducible complexity, different things like that. Those are hard questions to answer. And so it kind of forces them to think, even though they completely dismiss God. These debates that intelligent design people have are kind of pushing the issue, and I think some people are starting to open their minds a little bit.
Yeah, I'll comment that about the only reason I could do what I did was that I was considered a valued employee because I excelled in what I did. I did a good job in my work and was considered essentially indispensable in my group. So if
Tolerated.
I was tolerated, and I believe God gave me special favor because there were atheists at the lab that would come to my supervisor, and in the midst of this letter debate, and say, "You've got to lean on him. It's bringing shame and credit to our exalted laboratory. You're hurting the name of our institution by allowing this to go on." And I believe it was the grace of God. He would say, as far as someone being at fault, you're the one at fault in lodging this kind of complaint. So I count it, as God's favor that He would give me and my supervisor that kind of support for me. But anyway, and I know of other Christian believers that have taken a bold position. There's a guy that was considered for the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, a professor of chemistry at, I can't remember, I think it was University of South Carolina, somewhere down there. Or he's in Georgia, one of the schools might have been, he's at Georgia Tech. And so he takes a bold stand. Because he's so good at what he does, so there are scientists.
John, what's his name?
Schaefer. What's his name? First name Schaefer. His last name Schaefer. Okay, I really want to get through this next section here. So as we contemplate, what's the takeaway message? Well, I'm saying that one takeaway message from what we just looked at is there can be only one rational explanation for how living things around us came into existence, and that is near instantaneous supernatural creation. I insist there can be no rational alternative to that. And for me, that this is a important plank in my entire worldview, realizing this, that all life around me, bacteria, every kind of animal, every plant, has to have been formed miraculously, near instantaneously and supernaturally, and that's the degree that God was involved in the creation of the world around us. And so I personally find it important to reflect on that reality frequently. Keep my head straight in the face of all the propaganda around us. Okay, so I want to move on to the second point. Life specifications are non-material and are therefore beyond the reach of any material explanation. Now, our culture, we have been so conditioned by materialist philosophy for the last, since the Enlightenment. That was a major thrust of Enlightenment thinking of the 1700s and into the 1800s. And by the 20th century, materialist philosophy was well entrenched. Communism, for example, was referred to as dialectic materialism, emphasis on nothing supernatural. There is no supernatural reality. That has been hammered into us. It continues to be dogmatically taught that everything that exists, everything that's real, can be constructed from the elementary particles of physics. That's what materialism is. So that truth is all around us, is just as pervasive as evolution. It's part of that same worldview, but it's at perhaps a little deeper level than evolution, namely that there is nothing that's non-material. That non-material things are fairy tales, just like the tooth fairy. It's a fairy tale. It doesn't correspond to reality. Okay, so materialism automatically rules out God. Automatically, if materialism true, there cannot be God. God is just a fantasy. Moreover, there can't be a human soul or a human spirit. That's simply fantasy as well. So this materialistic viewpoint profoundly affects who we understand ourselves to be as human beings. That you're just a collection of atoms. You're ultimately no different from this television monitor as far as what makes you up. You're made out of the same stuff as dirt and TV monitors. So and that's a pretty bleak thing to teach children, but that's what they're being taught in Ramona schools. It's just outrageous. All right. Prior to the mid-20th century, no one even imagined that the genetic specifications in living things would turn out to be linguistic in nature and therefore non-material. That idea, as far as you can look in the literature, just nobody even suspected that. However, the genetic specifications in DNA are indeed linguistic in nature. The DNA language, as we have already seen, involves an alphabet, a vocabulary, and a grammar. The DNA alphabet consists of 4 letters, A, T, C, and G. The vocabulary for describing proteins consists of 64 3-letter words, very a finite, well-specified vocabulary. And And there have been a few of the grammatical rules discovered, but it appears that most of the grammatical rules for understanding the information in DNA are yet to be discovered. And so this is the DNA codon dictionary. A codon is 3 letters, and so these words are each 3 letters long, and there's 64 of them. And these, the left-hand column is the amino acid, plus a few punctuation characters, stop codons, and these are the actual 3-letter sequence that code for each of those amino acids. You see in some case, in a couple of cases, 3 cases, there are 6 3-letter words that code for the same amino acid. And it turns out that the fact that multiple words can code for the same amino acid, that is important in the way the DNA is constructed. It allows to have overlapping messages. It allows you to have the code to make sense read forward or backward by using different words for the same amino acid in the different messages. But you'd have to have a mind so far beyond ours to do that. It just causes my head to spin to try to imagine that. Anyway, the point is that you've got language here. You've got a vocabulary. You've got words. You've got an alphabet. You've got rules. You've put together a specific vocabulary. Okay, the discovery of the details of how DNA carries and transmits heritable genetic traits resulted in a huge new challenge for Neo-Darwinian theory. And that challenge, how to account for coded linguistic specifications in a purely materialistic manner. Let's look at why that represents such a huge challenge. First, we need to talk about what language is. And this is extremely important. You probably have never been exposed to this information before. So what is language? Well, I have a pretty simple description of what language is in a sense that covers computer language, genetic language, and human language. If there's 2 components. One, an assignment of meaning. So we want to talk about what is meaning. I think we understand, but it's an assignment of meaning, which is an abstract entity. Assignment of meaning to a set of otherwise arbitrary symbols to form a vocabulary. We saw in the preceding slide how that's done in the case of genetics. And then a set of rules by which elements or words from the vocabulary may be joined together to create arbitrarily complex meaning structures. In other words, you can take the words of the English language, follow the rules of grammar, English grammar, string them together, and describe almost anything. You can write a novel, you can write an encyclopedia, you can write down written specifications for how to build a 747. There's all kinds of things you can do. There's almost, pardon?
Love letters.
You write love letters?
That's too
we
complex.
need the fifth.
That explains a lot.
We'll pray for you, Debbie.
You can write poetry. You can write poetry. You can write prophecy, like in the Bible. You can write all kinds of things. So language, the key thing here is that language encodes meaning. And meaning is a non-material quantity. And I'll illustrate that now. What we're talking about with meaning. So an example of assignment to meaning to symbols, in this case I'm talking about sounds, like we have in human language. There's a certain meaning that in English is associated to the sound dog. Okay? Certain range of meaning that's associated with that sound in English. But that sound is an arbitrary sound. Not every human on earth associates that meaning with that sound. In some places, that meaning is associated with the sound hunt, or kien, or sobaka, or kane, or perro, or gao. Okay? Sobaka is Russian for dog. Gao is Chinese for dog. Okay? So here's an example of assigning meaning to symbols, okay, to create a vocabulary. So we can assign other meanings to other sounds to build up a vocabulary, okay? Example of joining vocabulary elements or symbols together to form a more complex meaning structure. We might write an English sentence. The guide dog led the blind girl through the city traffic. You know, a moderately complex idea there, encoded in just a few words, and you have rules for joining these vocabulary elements together to describe something. Okay, so this is the essence of what language is, how language works. So we have many kinds of language today. We have human language, which can either be spoken, or we have most languages today have a written version. So you have written human languages, spoken human languages. We even have human sign language for people that don't speak or hear. Okay. We have computer language. All the software responsible for all our computers, your cell phones, and all the computers in your cars and so on. All of that is language. There's vocabulary, there's meaning assigned, rules, and I'm going to argue that mathematics is an example of language, as it satisfies all those criteria. And then genetic language satisfies that definition I gave. Now I want to emphasize that language belongs to a non-material category of reality. A message, when reliably transmitted, is identical whether it is carried by acoustic waves through the air, like my voice is being transmitted by compressional waves through the air. Whether it's relayed electronically, it could be amplified. I can talk on my cell phone. There's all kinds of transformations that goes on. The message can be faxed, emailed, encrypted, sent through the mail on a DVD, or carried via smoke signals. The point is that the message is independent of the material carrier. There's a reality there that doesn't depend on matter. It's the meaning that's getting transmitted, and it's encoded by language, and that meaning is something. Meaning is something that's non-material. And I know a lot of people were so conditioned to think everything is material that when you're first exposed to that idea, it's hard to get hold of it. It's hard to believe it's true. But let me ask you: is language important? Is language real? Yeah. Is it important? How much human activity does not involve language? There's almost nothing we do. Language.
Body language.
Pardon?
Even body language.
Yeah. Yeah. There's all the economic and political structures that we have. All the commerce. Almost everything we do involves language. So I once knew a linguist who helped me understand this, and his thesis was that as far as the image of God in man, one of the biggest aspects of the image of God in man is language capacity. That language gives human beings close to God-like power. So this ability to impress impress meaning on symbols and create vocabularies and form sequences of vocabulary elements and to pass those on. All that what's involved in language is a non-material phenomenon. And the fact that I can formulate language, I can put meaning together. That this is sort of an extra comment here, but that is pointing to that we as human beings, that there's a non-material component within us that enables us to do that. So that implies that we are not simply material ourselves, that we possess, that we're part of us, an important part of us is non-material.
Is the mind immaterial?
I would say yes, is the way we normally understand mind. Mind seems, because it produces.
They don't know, I mean, they know there's the brain, but it's not the brain
That's right, that's right. So what we would refer to as mind, because it produces, most of what it produces is non-material, it would argue, you might well infer that the mind is something non-material. Yes.
It's making me think, I was reading a book about Islam and what they think we believe and what we believe, and vice versa, what they think, we think that they believe and all that. And they believe that we are polytheistic because they can't understand the concept of the Trinity. And apparently language is very important to the Arabs, and poetry in particular. They held those people in high honor. And the way to explain the Trinity to them is using vocabulary or words, because if you can consider that the thought of a word is formed in your brain, then that would be of the Trinity God. And the mechanics of your mouth, your tongue, your voice box, or whatever would be Jesus, who's the representative God that we can see. And then the words come out of your mouth, and you can't see them, but they have meaning and they do something, and that would be the Holy Spirit. That's the one analogy that they grasp to understand the Trinity.
The other night on Nat Geo, they have a program called Brain Games, and they show amazing things that the mind does. And they did a test on babies, just to make it real quick. They put electrodes on their heads, and babies can hear every sound that the voice can utter, but adults, as you grow, you can't. And so that's why babies learn language, because they can make those sounds that we can't even roll our tongue to do. But God gave them the capacity from birth. I thought that was amazing.
Yeah, the how we acquire language, is a major field of study, and it basically is pointing to, that language is something non-material. So I want to finish this off, at least this part. It's interesting that Albert Einstein recognized that language is not material. He recognized that there exists a logically unbridgeable gulf between the realm of concepts and propositions and the realm of what we see, hear, taste, and touch. And so, here's a quote from Einstein. It's been picked up by linguists, and they pick up his words gulf in trying to describe or talk about language. Einstein said, "We have the habit of combining certain concepts and conceptual relations so definitely with certain sense experiences that we do not become conscious of the gulf, logically unbridgeable, which separates the world of sensory experiences, the physical world, from the world of concepts and propositions." So, and to Einstein, this was an unsolved, something unsolved and unsolvable. He understood by science. He saw that this was something that science, the science that he was engaged with, really couldn't penetrate. So linguists have picked up on that quote, and linguists point out that there is a gulf, an unbridgeable gulf between a bodily thing, such as he was just a puppy, our dog Tiffany, shown at the left, A bodily thing exists on the side opposite the Einstein gulf from the word dog, which can be used to refer to a dog. The two entities are in separate categories of reality. The word is not a dog, and the dog is not a word. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So we're talking about two realms of reality there. And that is an illustration of what Einstein was referring to. And linguists, at least some of them, point this out. There is this gulf between language and what language describes. Okay. So is mathematics language? Yes, mathematics involves assignment of meaning to sets of symbols and specification of a set of rules or axioms for manipulating the symbols. And this has an important implication. It implies that the laws of physics represent a linguistic description of the structure of the material world. Okay? So it basically is saying that this material world has linguistic underpinnings. The laws of physics, the laws of physics and chemistry represent a linguistic substructure underneath the physical world that we live in. So just like biology, it's underpinned by genetic information, the physical world seems to have that same characteristic of having linguistic descriptions that underpin it. So just a couple of things should be obvious. Can material processes generate language? Laws of chemistry and physics, in those laws there's not the slightest hint that any language generation capacity resides in the material components from which the natural world is fashioned. And that reason is simple. Language is ultimately a non-material phenomenon. So there's no reason to even suspect that material entities could generate language. So it has to do with this separation of categories. I'm going through this somewhat fast, but hopefully you're connecting. All right, what about random processes? Can random processes generate language? Well, I wrote a little program. I wrote a little program that generates English letters at random. I included the space in there, and I also used the frequency that these letters actually occur in English words. Okay, and I just generated a sequence of 800 characters at random.
Non, you got non.
Yeah, you can find a few places where embedded in some of these sequences there are meaningful English words. So yada and not,
Whoa, you.
So, but basically, random processes do not generate language, and because that key feature of assignment of meaning is missing, is missing here. So, the preceding slide displayed a random sequence of 800 characters. It's not surprising that the result is gibberish. Why must this be the case? Because the defining aspect of language is missing, namely assignment of meaning. Random processes never generate meaning-bearing strings. Also here, that illustrates what happened if you randomly change letters in a meaning-bearing sequence. You transform that sequence into gibberish. And that's the mechanism that Neo-Darwinism has. And so you can understand why Neo-Darwinism is not going to work. I've already said that was this slide. Moreover, random changes in text strings that carry meaning-bearing messages invariably turn those messages into gibberish. This implies that the Neo-Darwinian expectation that random mutations can and do lead to improvements in an organism's genetic specifications is without any logical basis. So what is language? we've seen its assignment of meaning to a set of otherwise arbitrary symbols to form a vocabulary, a set of rules by which these elements from the vocabulary can be joined together to create more complex meaning structures. Language encodes meaning. Meaning is non-material, therefore language structures are non-material. And reiterate, we have these kind of linguistic specifications in DNA. This is a huge challenge for Neo-Darwinian theory, the challenge of how to account for coded linguistic specifications in a materialistic manner. And Darwinists try to evade that issue. That's all they can do. They don't have any answer. I might point out here, materialist philosophy is predicated on the belief that there are no non-material realities. Language is an irrefutable counterexample to this claim. In short, language falsifies the entire materialist framework. Materialist philosophy, materialist worldview is falsified by the fact that language exists, it's real, it's important in our world. So there's no reason to be intimidated by materialists. They're the ones that are, in the dark and have bought a lie. And it's easy to demonstrate that.
So when you say God is spirit, is that the same as God is language?
No, I don't think so. But God certainly has an important aspect of God is His ability to speak and to use language, and the Bible says that was the way He brought this creation into being. By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made, and by the breath of His mouth, all their hosts.
Language.
So He spoke, and and things came into existence. So that by itself shows the power of language.
I like the way John 1:1 starts out too. In the beginning
Right.
with the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Can't get any clearer than
Yeah.
that.
And so that very truth, that very reality is in those first verses of John.
Mhm.
And it's interesting that John chooses, and he's almost certainly writing in Greek. He chooses a key word in Greek philosophy, logos, and gives it in that Greek culture, it was just pregnant with meaning. What those words in John, those first words, mean. I might mention, if you're interested, I have a more detailed account of this section we've just gone through on language. It's a paper that was published in last December in the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society. It's entitled A Linguistic Argument for God's Existence. My co-author is Jeremy Lyon. So it's posted on my website, our website, logosresearchassociates.org. If you find me on the website under About Us, you'll find my picture. And then if you go down more underneath my picture, you'll find a list of my publications. And this one is near at the top of the list because it starts with A. So anyway, if you'd like to read more about it, it also has some of the pictures. It has the picture of our dog Tiffany in here. It has that. So if you'd like to look more, so we're just about out of time. I'll just give you a preview for next week. Now we've gotten through the most difficult concepts, and now we're ready to really move forward. We're based on request of several people, we're not going to meet Easter Sunday. Going to resume on the following Sunday, the 3rd, I believe, the 3rd of April. And hopefully we will have the, at some point, be able to, you'll be able to see these YouTube, the video of this session on YouTube. So any final question? That's all I'm planning to cover today. Well, I hope it's been encouraging to you. Let's close in prayer. Father, we truly marvel at your power and your creativity and your just how dynamic you are in what you've made. You've revealed that. We think of that verse in Romans 1 that you've revealed yourself in what has been made. And as we consider what we've considered today, it should be breathtaking, even more breathtaking to us. So pray you might encourage us, you might help us to get hold of these concepts so we might be better able to help those that are still in darkness. So thank you for your goodness to us. Thank you for all your blessings. Thank you for this Easter week that we're beginning. Thank you for your love for us. In Jesus' name.